Hello and welcome to the 23rd presentation in the Virtual History series, presented by Baltimore Architecture Foundation and Baltimore Heritage. This presentation is also part of Doors Open Baltimore Design Excellence Week. This is Nathan Denny's Associate Director at the Baltimore Architecture Foundation. First, thank you to everyone who donated to be with us today. And thank you to our Doors Open sponsors, grantors, and in-kind supporters. Through your support, we've been able to host free Doors Open programs nearly every day this month, and we still have a week of programs to go. And as I mentioned earlier, this presentation is part of our Design Excellence Week. I hope you can join us today at 4 o'clock for the AIA Baltimore and Baltimore Architecture Foundation Excellence in Design Awards celebration. The Hoen Lithograph Building happens to be one of the nominees. Will it win an award this evening? Join us at the award celebration to find out. See this and all the Doors Open offerings at www.doorsopenbaltimore.org. There's also still time to enter our Instagram at-home photo contest. Photograph architectural details of your neighborhood using the hashtag DoorsOpenBaltimore. The contest ends on October 31st. Visit our website for more details. And now today's presentation. We are joined by Adam Rhodes Brown of Cross Street Partners, the developer of the project, and Jonathan Lessum, architect with Ziger Snead. I also want to give a shout out to Joanne Stallings of Cross Street Partners for coordinating today's program, and also mention that this project recently received a Baltimore Heritage Award, in addition to being nominated for an AIA Baltimore Award this evening. Before we get started, I just also want to mention, please add questions you have for the team in the Zoom chat box. We will get to as many as we can at the end. With that, take it away.
Great, thanks Nathan. Let me just get my screen sharing here. Can everyone see that?
Looks good.
Okay, great. So I'll start by giving a quick overview of the project and some context for the neighborhood and the development. And then I'll pass it over to Jonathan, who was the architect for the project, and he can talk a little bit about the building history, the construction and design, and then I will take back over to describe the tenancy and the spaces that each tenant is occupying. So I've been working on this project since 2014. We've had a number of Doors Open Baltimore tours, so some of you may have already been to the building. It certainly has transformed a lot over the years. Originally, this property was owned by Baltimore City and was put out for RFP, which we replied to in 2014. There were a number of issues with the site, including environmental contamination, but our interest mostly stemmed from the significant investment that was happening to the south in EBDI, which is an 88-acre area that Johns Hopkins has invested a significant amount of money in. Hoen was really one of the first commercial redevelopment efforts to the north of the tracks. If anyone has been around that area, the railroad tracks really serve as a dividing line between a neighborhood that is experiencing a lot of disinvestment over the years versus EVDI, which has seen a ton of investment in new facilities, a new hotel, a new park, new residential. So the idea was that we were trying to capture some of this momentum and push development up to the north. And to do it in a way that could help improve the surrounding community, which is the Collington Square community. So that's a little bit of background on the development. The concept that we came up with after a lot of different ideas and investigations is something that we're calling the Center for Neighborhood Innovation. The Center for Neighborhood Innovation is a collection of for-profit and nonprofit enterprises that are focused on community development, bringing jobs to the community, and opportunity to people who live there. So it took a lot of different partners to make this project happen. Cross Street Partners and City Life Community Builders, City Life Historic Properties were the developers. Ziger Snead Architects led the design. Obviously we worked with the Maryland Historical Trust. It's a LEED Gold project. And there's a large collection of consultants and experts to help us complete the project. This was an incredibly difficult project to both finance, lease, and build. And you'll see in some of the pictures today why that was. This includes, trees growing through the masonry walls, PCB contamination, a neighborhood was maybe 50% vacant when we started this project. So it was an incredibly difficult thing to execute, but we're currently 98% leased and have a fantastic group of tenants that we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. So from there, Jonathan, do you want to talk a little bit about the history of the building?
Sure. I'm Jonathan Lessum. I'm with Ziger Snead Architects. We've been involved with Cross Street Partners on this project since going back to 2015, when really the building was in terrible shape, and its current state was almost unimaginable given the condition it was in before. Several different projects combined. It started off as a clearing and stabilization project, then became a restoration and rehabilitation project for core and shell, and then followed by a number of tenant improvements. And as Adam mentioned, it would not have been possible without historic tax credits through the Maryland Historic Trust, and it was for core and shell a LEED Gold project. To give a little bit of history on Hoen Lithograph as a company, it started in 1835. It was founded by August Hoen along with his uncle Edward Weber. They had their original building downtown, basically across from City Hall, and it burned down in 1901. And then they moved to this site in 1902. They did lithography, but August Hoen had invented an innovative process for lithography that really made Hoen Lithograph an industry leader. They printed almost anything you can imagine, from huge maps down to soup can labels and everything in between, illustrations. Some of the mapping conventions that they developed here are still in use by the U.S. Geological Survey. Once they moved to this site, the plant employed about 100 people working around the clock, and quite a few of them lived in the surrounding neighborhood and literally walked to work. They were quite busy up until about the post-war years, and then the changes in the industry sort of left them behind, and eventually they had to close their doors in 1981. Most of the equipment was sold, and the property has basically been vacant since then. Next. So talk a little bit about the buildings on the site. Click the next one. So the building that just highlighted is now called the Stone Building. We have been calling it Building 1. It is one of the two original buildings on the site. It's about 300 feet long, has about 45,000 square feet of floor area on 2 main levels and 2 mezzanines. Click the next one, please. And then what just highlighted is Building 4, which was the other original building from 1885. This is basically the energy plant for the factory. This is where the boiler was, and it drove engines, the steam drove engines that turned belts, which linked over into Building 1 and drove line shafts. And this is what drove all of the equipment on the factory floor. Building 1 and Building 4, again, were built in 1885, originally for the Baxter Electric Company, which built electric motors in this space. Then in late 1800s, it was taken over by the Bagby Furniture Company until 1902, when Hoen bought the plant. And then in 1902, they built the what we've called Building 2. It's now called the Inc. Building. Then click the next one. And then buildings 5 and 6 are dated post-war. They're not historic, not considered contributing. It's concrete block and steel joist, very utilitarian warehouse type construction. Next, please. And when we first started on the site, all the spaces in between the original buildings was filled with what we called Building 3. And this is just low infill. It was deemed to be non-historic and non-contributing construction, so we were able to remove that to create the courtyards that we have now. Next, and then next. So this is the site as it stands now. The stone and ink buildings have been restored pretty much to their original configuration. Buildings 4, 5, and 6 have been consolidated into a single property that's now the ABC Construction Academy, which Adam will talk about a little bit later. And you can see off to the side the lithograph image, probably done by Hoen, of the site as it stood, probably around in the early 1900s. Okay. This is just a snippet of an interesting drawing that was discovered inside the building, and it shows the floor layout for the lithograph plant. This is a fire protection drawing. We don't really have the date for it, but it gives you an idea of how things were laid out inside the building, in a really neat artifact that we found. Talk a little bit about the redevelopment. It's almost hard to overstate how bad a condition the site was. It was completely overgrown with vegetation. If you can click to the next one. There were vegetation everywhere. As Adam mentioned, that there was a PCB contamination in Building 4, where someone had tried to break into an old transformer. That all had to be remediated. We had trees literally growing inside the walls. Of a particularly voracious kind of tree that liked the mortar in the masonry and would grow in and through the walls and was doing considerable damage, especially to Building 4. So really the first step in all of this was clearing the vegetation, removing the trees from the walls, stabilizing the structure. The building had been abandoned for a good 20 to 30 years. As you can imagine, that neglect had led to roof leaks, and there was insect damage and some structure that had to be supplemented and replaced before we could take another step on the renovation. Keep going. In the process of clearing out the building, all kinds of artifacts were found. Hundreds of lithograph stones were found throughout the site. Next one. Also, lots of glass plates. I mean, the Hoen Lithograph printed a lot of the maps for the National Geographic Society, and tons of plates left over from that process. In general, we had a lot of stabilization work to do. Then the rehabilitation part kicked in. That included replacing all of the windows, creating new life safety components, new stairs, new elevators, basically bringing the means of egress for the building up to code, and upgrading mechanical systems, electrical systems, fire protection systems to meet code. We had to restore the roofs. Because of the historic constraints from the historic tax credits, there were limits to what we could do to augment the performance of the envelope with insulation. Most of the new insulation is in the roof structure. We weren't allowed to cover up the interior walls because they had never been covered up in the past, with one small exception. These slides that you're seeing here are before and afters of the principal facades. You can see all the new windows in the openings, the restored roofs, the lots and lots of masonry restoration. There were some fabulous details in the masonry. Believe it or not, this slide is a view of the exact same place before and after. On the left is an image standing inside building 3, which is now gone. And you're facing the entrance into building 1, and on the right is that restored entrance. So that really is a before and after, even though they're not even remotely similar. This is a view inside of building 1, facing a large opening that is now part of Strong City Baltimore's main conference room. This is a view also in building 1, facing north in the Strong City space. What you see on the left is a mezzanine at the far north end, and that was the Hoen sort of management offices, where the managers could stand on the mezzanine and overlook the shop floor. This slide is showing the interior of that space. This was the only part of the building that had what we would consider a finished interior, and we were required to restore that. So this is the only space where you'll see plaster interiors, wood moldings around the windows. The floor there that you see is original and was restored in place. This is at the far south end of building 1, the huge restored windows. This is also at the north end of building 1, again facing that mezzanine, and you can see the transformation of the space for Strong City. The interior we were allowed to clean, but not to change the interior finishes. So you see a lot of the patina on old paint on columns, old paint on walls. The floors are just basic ground and polished concrete. Floors are new. This is in the upstairs of building 2. One large space. Under all the grime, we found a maple floor that was still in really pretty good condition. It required patching and it required a lot of work, and people pulling what seemed like millions of nails out of the surface before it could be refinished. But it turned into a stunning space. And this is in the courtyard between building 4 on the left and building 1 on the right. This is after building 3 had been removed, but you can still see trees growing in the walls. So this is before restoration. And this is the courtyard that's sort of in the center between, you're facing building 2 in this image. The beams overhead are the former roof structure of building 3 that was left in place. So this is the central courtyard space that has resulted. And this is a night view of that same space. With that, I'll hand it off to Adam.
Great. So, a little bit more about the complex. It's an 85,000 square foot building that occupies an entire city block. As I said earlier, the concept for the redevelopment ended in a plan that we're calling the Center for Neighborhood Innovation, which is this group of nonprofits and for-profits that are focused on neighborhood transformation. And so there is a really fantastic group of tenants in the building. Associated Builders and Contractors has a construction academy. City Life Community Builders is a nonprofit that does construction training. Strong City Baltimore runs an adult learning center, and there's a fantastic set of shared amenities for all of these tenants. So actually, I can go into a little more detail on this. So this is the ground floor plan. Strong City has their adult learning center on the southern side of the building, and they have their administrative and offices on the north side of building 1. City Life Community Builders is taking the south side of building 2, and Associated Builders and Contractors has all of buildings 4, 5, and 6. The historic building is where they have their offices, and the warehouse buildings are where they do their construction training. So this is the mezzanine plan for the space. So there's actually two mezzanines, one in building 1 and one in building 2. They overlook what would have been the factory floors in both of these buildings, and it's kind of where the management would sit. We built a new mezzanine on the ground floor of building 1, and this consists of small private offices that are available for small organizations with, say 1 to 4 people. So the second floor of the complex has an amazing shared amenity space. It's got 7 shared conference rooms that you can reserve on an app. It's got a great kitchen, social gathering space. The deck is not built yet, but we're planning to build that next year. And then you have Cross Street Partners, Morgan State University, and Outlook Company on the second floor. So Outlook is a animation studio that we can talk about in a little bit. A little more detail about Strong City. So they have they're a 50-year-old nonprofit that operates a variety of different programs. Some of their larger programs are their adult learning center, where they train over 650 people per year. A lot of English as a second language students who are seeking their GEDs participate in their program. They're also a fiscal sponsor for over 100 nonprofits in Baltimore, and they operate a few other programs, including the 28th Street Community Center and the club at Collington Square. The club is this amazing after-school program for children in the neighborhood. They help them with their homework and serve them a meal, and it's just like a really fantastic program that operates out of like 4 tiny row homes about a block away. So they really have a great connection to the local community stakeholders. So this is another picture of Strong City Space. So Morgan State University has a presence in the building. It's 2 separate programs from Morgan. One is a group called RCMI. RCMI is a research organization that puts healthcare, public health experts in partnership with kind of behavioral health leaders, and they are exploring why certain diseases affect minority populations in Baltimore more than other populations. So obviously during COVID, they're rapidly expanding this effort and needed some additional space. The other space that Morgan has in the project is just administrative swing space for when they renovate a building and need a place to put people. So Cross Street Partners is moving our offices from the can company over to Hoen. Very excited to be actually working out of the project that I've been working on for so long. So the space is pretty amazing. City Life Community Builders, they're a nonprofit that does residential construction and construction training. So them in partnership with ABC is a really interesting group of tenants, and we'll kind of see where those kind of connections can go. So next, this is a more recently signed tenant, Outlook Enterprises. They're an amazing animation studio owned by Trevor Price, who's a former NFL player. They're taking quite a bit of space in the building and are rapidly expanding and raising money. They have a couple of shows that are on Netflix, and they're in the process of turning Kolpari into a movie right now. So, Trevor does amazing work. They're rapidly expanding. I think they have about 30 employees now, and they're looking to double that over the next 12 or 18 months. So it's really cool kind of creative component to the project that we're very excited about. So Outlook is currently actually operating out of the City Life space. Their lease was up at MICA, and they needed a space to go, and City Life didn't need their office immediately. So they're actually in and working at Hoen, you know, with 3D suits, and it's pretty cool technology. So finally, the last kind of large anchor tenant is Associated Builders and Contractors. So they're the non-union side of construction training in the state of Maryland, and they're also a trade organization that has a large group of members that are in the construction fields. So they train about 500 to 600 people per year. They also operate Project Jumpstart with the Jobs Opportunity Task Force. So their construction academy basically takes people who have a job in construction and they upskill them to become full-time journeymen. So they essentially take people who are making $10 to $15 an hour in the construction industry and get them to become a full journeyman where they could be making $80,000 or $100,000 a year. So this is the Construction Training Academy is in buildings 5 and 6, and this is what the warehouse buildings look like before they were renovated. This was the roof decking had already been taken off, but I can't say it looked very different from being completely removed because there were so many holes in this space. It almost rained more inside the building than outside. But this is what it looks like now, and it's really fantastic. So I think that is the end of the slides that we have. But if people have questions, we're happy to go into more detail.
Sure, thank you. This was a great presentation. Thank you again, Jonathan and Adam. And we do have some questions that are coming in through the chat here. Questions about what happened to all of the interesting artifacts you found from the lithograph company. Joe mentioned in the chat that some of it is going to JHU library, but is there anything else you can speak to that you found? What were some of the most interesting things that you discovered in the building?
Yeah, sure. So we're actually in the process of making, so we're kind of in the process of putting the finishing touches on the building, still working on some like planners and landscaping, and one of those big elements that we're trying to wrap up is a historic display. So we're working with Mary Mashburn from Micah who is actually in printmaking to kind of detail the printmaking process and display the different artifacts that we have that demonstrate the different stages of that process. So I'd say probably the coolest and craziest thing that we found was we were actually digging up concrete in building 4 for environmental remediation. And we uncovered basically a huge pit of lithograph stones, which are these enormous limestone blocks that the company had just used for infill. And my understanding is these are actually pretty expensive to buy for printmakers. And so they must have just had so many that they didn't know what to do with them, and they just buried them in the ground and covered them in concrete. So I think we're going to display at least a collection of the best ones on the wall in the lobby. So, if you come back and visit the building, you'll be able to see some of those artifacts.
Very cool. Okay, next question we have here is, were there any special considerations or exceptions, being that it's a historic structure, that had to be worked out with the fire marshal?
Jonathan, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, the more special considerations really came with negotiating with the Maryland Historic Trust about what would be allowed to be modified to accommodate life safety. The building is now fully sprinklered. It, from a code standpoint, it's been assessed based on its construction type and allowable occupant loads and whatnot. So we have the means of egress that are necessary, to make it a safe building. It really wasn't a tremendous negotiation with the fire marshal about the building from that standpoint. It was more coming to agreement with the historic trust about what would be allowed for new stairs, because the existing stairs were neither in the right place nor the right size nor properly protected to serve as life safety components in the renovated building.
Great. And speaking of the historical trust, so every year, I think for as long as I can remember, Baltimore Heritage, AIA, and Preservation Maryland go to Annapolis and advocate for more funding for the state historic tax credit. And Maryland is considerably underfunded compared to, say, neighboring states like Virginia. And can you talk a little bit about how important those tax credits were to completing this project?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it wouldn't have been possible without the vast number of different tax credit and public subsidy programs that we use to finance this project. To give you just a sense of things, I think when all is said and done, this will be about a $35 to $38 million project. There's only about 6.75 million of real debt on the project. So, the reason for that is that the tenants that this project has in it can't really pay more. We're sort of at the upper limit of what is possible in terms of rents, so for these nonprofit and mission-driven organizations. So, without a $3 million historic tax credit from the state of Maryland, and without the federal historic credits that will, ultimately end in maybe $5 million in net benefit to the project, projects like this would not be possible. The other thing I would add to that is just the cost to rehab these projects is enormous. I think you probably all saw from the pictures, trees growing through the walls and structural issues and roof and water penetration. It's a much more expensive thing to do than just building from the ground up. So, it's very important to save these buildings, but it costs more and it's more difficult.
Right. And can you also talk about the community engagement process you went through with this project, and what is the impact that this project has on the surrounding neighborhood?
Yeah, definitely. So the neighborhood association is called the Collington Square Neighborhood Association. It's actually part of the Broadway East Community Association. So, we got to a place where we were meeting every month or every other month with the community association and got a really good sense of what kind of transformation, what kind of tenants they were aspiring to have in their neighborhood. The building, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but the building has been vacant since 1979. So it's been a huge blight to the community. And, there's a tremendous amount of vacant row homes around the project, and no residential developer is going to come in and start developing those homes until this large entire city block is revitalized. So, yeah, I mean, the other major community stakeholder that's kind of right next to the building is the Israel Baptist Church. We're actually partnering with them on the parking needs for the building and helping them build a new lot for their existing group. So, there's been a ton of community involvement in the project. The club at Collington is another great example. The club was actually struggling a little bit financially, and Strong City came in and kind of took over ownership of the club and stabilized its operations, and were able to kind of keep the program going and keep these 100 kids with a place to stay and a place to get meals. So there's been a lot of interaction. It's been a really amazing experience.
Great. And what was the biggest lesson learned in your eyes on the project during the design and construction process? And this is for Jonathan.
I don't know that there's a single lesson learned. I think the biggest thing entering into any renovation project, but particularly one of this magnitude, is just the need on the part of everybody involved to stay resilient and flexible, because these buildings are, the gift that keeps giving in both the positive and the negative. And they're wonderful buildings. They have tremendous bones, but there are always surprises. Nothing is plumb and square. And as you clean things up and start to make repairs, you keep finding stuff. So I think that's the key thing, is you just have to be flexible and resilient, both as the developer and as the designer, to make it all happen.
Right, and I have another question about the lithograph stones that you found. How heavy are those stones, and how damaged were they when you found them?
They're about 3 inches thick, right?
Yeah, 3 or 4. They came in different sizes, so obviously different weights, but I'd say they probably ranged from 20 to 40 pounds. They're very heavy. And some of them are in really good shape, and some of them are kind of cracked and fading. So there's kind of a variety of conditions.
Yeah, that pit, they found in Building 4 is the equivalent of a recycling bin nowadays.
And last question here is, when you restored the mortar, were you careful to use a formulation suitable to the old, softer bricks?
Absolutely. The existing mortar was tested, and we had to adapt the type mortar so that it wouldn't be harder than the brick that it was being used on. Because if the mortar gets too hard, then you run the risk of basically breaking the bricks. The faces will start falling off. So it was very carefully modulated to match the type of mortar and the softness of the mortar that was there.
Great. Well, thank you both for joining us again for this presentation, and I'll see you later this afternoon for the Design Award celebration.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.